What if the history you were taught is a carefully constructed fairy tale? Look at the world around you. Really look. Why does every grand building from the 1800s have windows half buried in the dirt? Why are there functional, ornate doors leading into solid earth? They told us it was architectural style, but the soil tells a different story. A story of a global cataclysm, a mud flood, that wiped out a superior civilization just 200 years ago. This wasn't a natural disaster, it was a scheduled reset. And you weren't supposed to find the bottom floor. Look closely at the foundations of your city's oldest courthouse or post office. You'll see it. The basement windows that are perfectly aligned with the sidewalk, often half submerged in the earth. Historians call these light wells, a convenient excuse for a design that makes no sense. Why would 19th century architects, supposedly working with nothing but horse-drawn carts and hand tools, waste millions of dollars in labor to dig deep into the bedrock just to put a decorative window in the mud? The truth is much more chilling. These buildings weren't built with basements, they were buried. Across the globe, from Russia to America, from Australia to Europe, there is a consistent layer of red mud and silt that covers the first floors of our most magnificent structures. This is the physical evidence of the Great Reset, a global event that occurred somewhere between 1840 and 1850, leaving the survivors to dig out what remained of a world they no longer understood. They didn't build these cities, they inherited them. They found them abandoned, choked by millions of tons of clay, and they simply claimed them as their own, creating a fake construction history to hide the previous owners. The ground we walk on is not the original ground. We are literally walking on the roofs of a drowned civilization. Every step you take in London, Paris, or New York is atop a layer of forgotten history. Before the reset, there was another name on the maps. A name that has been systematically scrubbed from every modern textbook: Tartaria. If you look at maps from the 1600s and 1700s, you see a massive empire spanning from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, and even into North America. This wasn't just a nomadic tribe, it was a high-tech global civilization. They mastered free energy. Look at the spires of the old world, the cathedrals and mosques. They aren't just for decoration, they are atmospheric energy harvesters. The crosses and crescents were once antennas, pulling electricity from the ether to power a world without wires or pollution. But the mud flood changed everything. The energy grid was destroyed, the records were burned, and the survivors were re-educated. The 1850s saw a sudden surge in asylums and orphanages. Why? Because the adults who remembered the old world had to be removed. They were the witnesses to the truth. The children, the orphans of the reset, were shipped on trains to repopulate the empty, mud-filled cities. They were taught a new language, a new history, and a new official timeline. The grand buildings they lived in were repurposed into government offices and museums, and the free energy tech was stripped out. We are living in the hollowed-out shell of an empire that reigned for 1,000 years. Perhaps the most audacious lie is the world fairs. Between 1850 and 1915, massive temporary cities were supposedly built in months using nothing but plaster and wood. In Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco, grand palaces, canals, and electrical grids appeared. Then, as soon as the fair ended, these multi-million-dollar structures were dynamited. Why? Because they weren't temporary. They were the original Tartarian cities that had been dug out of the mud. The fairs were actually liquidation sales of the old world's technology. The elites invited the public to see the wonders of the future to hide the fact that they were looking at the ruins of the past. They told us these buildings were made of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp. Yet, black and white photos show massive stone foundations and complex ironwork that would take decades to build today. They destroyed these cities because they couldn't explain how a society of primitive horse riders could create them. It was a mass-scale psychological operation. By burning the evidence, they ensured that the next generation would never know they were walking on the bones of a giant. These fairs weren't celebrations of progress. They were funeral rites for a lost world. When you see the photos of the White City in Chicago, ask yourself, Why destroy perfection? Because perfection proved the narrative was a lie. Look at the Earth from above and you will see them. Massive geometric stone structures shaped like stars. We are told these star forts were for defense, yet their geometry is far too complex for ballistics. They are found on every continent, perfectly aligned with the Earth's magnetic field. These were not forts, they were power plants. Before the mud flood, these star-shaped bastions acted as nodes in a global wireless energy grid. They were built over water sources, using the conductive properties of mineral-rich currents to generate frequency. When the silt of the 1840s reset arrived, it choked these systems. The water stopped flowing, the energy died, and the new owners simply converted these high-tech hubs into military prisons or parks. They had to hide the fact that the old world had conquered the laws of physics. They told us our ancestors were primitive so we wouldn't realize we are currently living in a technological dark age. Every star fort you see today is a tombstone for a civilization that had free energy. They are remnants of a crystalline grid that once powered the entire planet without a single wire. This energy was taken from us, hidden behind the walls of secrecy, and replaced with a grid we have to pay for. Where did the people go? The mid-1800s saw a massive census gap.d. Suddenly, the orphan train movement began. Over 250,000 children were shipped to the American West. These children didn't have parents because their parents were the victims of the cataclysm. They were the blank slates. The elites needed a population that didn't remember the previous world. If you don't remember that your city once had free energy and grand architecture, you will work for wages and live in a brick box without question. This is the tabula rasa of the 19th century. The grand asylums were not for the sick. They were for the dissidents, the ones who still talked about the world before the mud. They were silenced. History was rewritten in the newly established public schools. They gave us a version of the past where we are the heroes, slowly climbing out of the mud, while the truth is that we were pushed back into it. The orphans were the first generation of the lie. They were handed a world they were told was built by their fathers, but it was actually built by the giants who preceded them. This massive displacement of people was essential to solidify the new narrative. Chicago, 1871. London, 1666. San Francisco, 1906. Bottom. These were not accidental fires. They were evidence deletion protocols. When the mud couldn't hide the technology, fire did. These fires leveled stone and steel structures that should have been fireproof. Why? Because they were clearing the old Tartarian grid. After the fires, the cities were rebuilt with modern infrastructure, meaning electricity that could be metered and sold. They replaced the ether-based power with fossil fuels. We went from a civilization of abundance to a civilization of debt. The mud flood wasn't just a disaster, it was a heist. They stole the very air we breathe and sold it back to us in a battery. If you look at the top of a 19th century post office, you can still see where the antennas used to be. The grand facades were stripped of their copper and gold. The bells that once rang with healing frequencies were melted down into cannons. This was the final stage of the conquest, destroying the beauty of the old world to make the ugliness of the new world seem normal. We are the second-hand residents of a world we didn't build. The evidence is beneath your feet. The mud flood wasn't an end, but a beginning of a world where history is a weapon. They want you to think you are the pinnacle of achievement, but the buried windows tell a different story. It's time to stop looking at the history books and start looking at the walls. The reset is over, but the discovery has just begun. They are still hiding the maps. They are still hiding the truth about what lies beneath the Arctic. They are still hiding who we really are. Don't let them bury your mind like they buried the past. The dust is settling, and the truth is rising from the silt. Look for the first floor. Find the truth,